follow up on our several classes and lectures. I'm beginning chapter 10. Chapter 10 was about Middle East. Chapter 11 was about North Africa, MENA. Then chapter 12 is about Sub-Saharan Africa. I think that sort of a conceptual framework that covers all these three chapters, something called resource curse. Dutch disease, as I mentioned earlier, Dutch disease is part of the resource curse. So I want to elaborate in much more detail on what the resource curse is, major concepts, and some evidence, some literature, the way the current literature is developing. That'll help you understand much better all these three chapters. And Sub-Saharan Africa, the countries that are included in this sub-region, including Nigeria. Nigeria is one of those sort of highly resource-dependent and highly distorted economies, economically and politically. And the current sort of hostage crisis that is raising in Nigeria is Boko Haram, right? The group that is taking, how many girls there, right? School girls, hostage. They are sort of a part of this resource curse problem in Nigeria, which is described in chapter 12. Russia, we talk a little bit about Russia and Central Asia. Also, these countries must be looked at from resource curse perspectives. So this is highly comparative kind of inquiry, right? So first we need to know the literature concepts, then you go ahead and apply to different cases, right? Africa, Middle East, Russia, Central Asia, right? All these different countries. And these basic concepts must be transformed a little bit to fit each case. That's, I think, the beauty of this theory. And Russian resource curse study is very interesting. Russian resource curse. I introduced, Thomas Friedman's piece, Russian resource curse and Central Asian resource curse. That is one of the emerging theories, applications. So what we do today is first look at the major assumptions, concepts behind the resource curse, including the Dutch disease, and apply it a little bit to the sub-Saharan countries. Right? So as you realize now, I think we are looking at both sides of energy politics, the internal dynamics, which is resource curse, right, or Dutch disease. Then external dimension is like how U.S. and China linked to African energy, Central Asian energy, whether or not America is withdrawing from the Middle East, whether or not China is replacing the, that's external dimension, right? And this internal dimension, which is the resource curse, must be looked at together with this external foreign policy or energy diplomacy type of perspective. So today I think we are sort of about more internal dimension of the resource curse. Some textbook definitions. First, I think, as I mentioned earlier, right, the resource curse, why this is interesting and why this is important, I think is that someone says that this is sort of one of the most, right, most puzzling and perplexing discoveries of modern scholarship that span economics, political science, sociology, right? Many different subfields, right, cover this highly puzzling phenomenon called the resource curse. Yeah, I think this scholarship, I think, in terms of when it began, it's been quite a long time since scholars first, right, found this interesting. Because, you know, probably oil development. This scholarship began with oil development. Not in the first stage, but as time goes on, I mean, scholars found this paradox of plenty, right? The more abundant the resource is, right, the system more distorted. Economic system, political system. I think this is interesting because this goes against common sense. This goes against common sense. Common sense tells us if you gain riches, if you gain money from resource exports, right? It's the same as foreign investment, right? It must be used, I mean, if used well, right? The system must be improved, right? But the other way around, right? That's what attracted a lot of interest. So, most interesting academic question in history, right? I dare to say, for both economists and political scientists. In a nutshell, I think resource curse begins with this basic concept, right? There is a negative correlation between resource abundance, right, and economic growth on one hand, and democracy, democratic development, right? Most economists look at this phenomenon, and many political scientists look at this phenomenon, right? But currently, right, I mean, economic growth, political development, highly related, right? So there is no distinction between these two questions, economic growth and democratic development, because they are related. So political scientists also look at, right, economic growth. Economists look at democracy, right? There is no distinction between these two. So this is the basic starting point, right? Negative correlation between, right? He took this from this long tradition of academic scholarship. He shares this sort of a conception, right? The negative correlation between resource abundance, right? Resource riches, and, you know, economic growth and democracy. The literature is more developed on this question than this one, because this is more current type of academic research than this one. So economists went into this field first. Then political scientists joined later. Right? I think the first major study, a scholar who is known for this kind of study is Alan Gelb, who wrote this book, which is adaptation from IMF report in the 1980s. Right? Later, it came out as a book. The title, look at this title, Windfall Gains, Windfall Profits. Right? Is it a blessing or a curse? I think this study or IMF report was mainly on this aspect, right? negative correlation between resource abundance and economic growth. And mostly these studies, using many samples, many countries. Like they look at 24 of countries from Middle East, Africa, right? Then they set some hypothesis, right? Then they process it through some statistical testing. Right? Then they argue, well, look at all these 20 different countries, right? Then they came to a conclusion that, right, there is a negative correlation between economic growth and resource abundance, right? You need some research design to make that argument, right? Then economic growth, you need to be looking at some measurements of economic growth, right? Not only economic growth rate, but also many other, right, measurements. Then how do you measure then resource abundance, right? How do you measure resource abundance? Like when you take samples from different regions, different countries, how would you pick, how would you select those countries that are abundant in resources? Maybe first you need to select countries maybe in the category of having a high level of resource exports, right? Per maybe revenue, state income, right? Or several other, various measurements of resource abundance, right? That is what he did in his research. Second famous study that followed this Ellen Gelb study was Sachs and Warner. Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is known for this type of study. In the 1990s, he released several studies with Andrew Warner. So Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner like this study, natural resource abundance and economic growth. Right? Exactly this title, natural resource abundance and economic growth. Came out 1995 from when he was at Harvard, right? Harvard Institute for International Development. Very famous study, right? Most often cited by many scholars. Another famous, this time, political scientist, Terry Lynn Carr. Oh, sorry, this is L. Terry Lynn Carr, who was at Stanford, political scientist. The title of the book, The Paradox of Plenty. As a political scientist, I think she found this very interesting from a political scientist perspective. And her case is mostly in the Latin American, Caribbean countries. And she starts from the same, paradox, right? She begins with the same question. In her research in, political science, she found this paradox very interesting. The question, why many countries in the Latin American countries, right, compared to East Asian countries, despite the fact that they have abundance of resources, including agricultural crops, agricultural production, despite the abundance, physical abundance, and despite the revenues they gain from exports of these raw materials, the performance, economic performance goes, the opposite direction, So she raised the same question. I mean, what explains this paradox, right? Sort of a counterintuition, right? This goes against common sense. So she begins with the same question. This is the statement from Jeffrey Sachs. According to Jeffrey Sachs, like I said, this phenomenon, resource curse, is a recurring motif of economic history. From economic historians' perspective, this is a recurring theme in many scholars' research. Right? I don't know exactly the beginning point, but I mean this theme attracted the attention of scholars from the 40s, 1940s, because many Latin American countries, they were very active and prosperous, even in the 19th century, like Venezuela, Colombia. They were, or Argentina, right? Look at their economies in the 19th century. They were, to some, they were even more prosperous than, or prospective than the American economy at some point in the 19th century. Right? Over time, the Latin American economies, I think, fell behind, but the prospect in the 19th century were very high at that time. Right? So this study is Jeffrey Sachs is right, this study is a recurring theme from economic historians' perspective. And even in the 20th century, right, even more interesting dynamic going on about this question. Still today, 21st century, right? And 20th century, a little bit different dynamics, right? 20th century, 21st century, right? As Jeffrey Sachs argues, this is recurring, right? This is statement from Terry Lynn Carr, right? Statement from her book. It's worthwhile to read a little bit, right? This is exactly what she wrote. Countries that are dependent on petroleum revenues for their livelihood are among the most economically troubled, like I said, right? Particularly in Latin American region, right? The most authoritarian. Their political system tends to be more dictatorial, right? When they have more resources, right? And conflict. Resource abundance also explains conflicts, right? There are more dictators, right? Resource abundant countries, they tend to have more dictators, and they tend to have more wars. Although this is not 100% proven, right? We need many more samples, right? We need to look at a lot of wars, right? Then there must be causes for wars, right? Then we need to prove resource problem is the most important determinant for conflicts. This is a very difficult testing, right? But I mean, the question hypothesis is very interesting and worthwhile to look at. And this is true. I mean, her assumption was this is true across regions. Right? This is what we do across regions, not only the Middle East, but also in Asia, Africa, Latin America, right? Where a lot of developing countries are located, right? Many developing I think what this means is that many developing countries, they suffer this problem, right? Regardless of regions, right? This is what makes this problem more interesting. And oil exporting countries grow more slowly than non-oil exporting countries over time. OPEC countries grow more slowly than non-OPEC countries. And according to some research, 1965, 1980, OPEC members, their average growth rate 1.3% per year. Non-oil exporters 2.2% per year. This is just, for example, I mean, statistical, correlation indicates that non-oil-based countries grow faster. Right? Economic performance is higher than resource-dependent countries. Okay. Maybe. And institutions also, less developed. This is all from Terry Linkar. Now, evidence. So you know what the basic concept is, right? Negative correlation. The evidence, there have been many studies into like a period of 1960, 1980. Oil exporting, mineral exporting countries, relatively high rates of economic growth rate, but 1980, 1993 have lower growth rates decline. What this indicates is that I think economic growth rate in resource exporting countries rely more on, right, resource prices. Right? When resource prices are good, the economic growth rate goes okay. Right? When resource prices are low, the economic growth rate faces problems. Right? I think what this indicates this. Interestingly, I mean, there's some study on Spain and the Netherlands in the 17th century. Right? That time, Spain was resource abundant. Right? They have, overflow of gold and silver from colonies. Right? And the Netherlands was like East Asian countries. Right? They're resource poor, but economic growth rate, Netherlands better than Spain. Right? This is evidence from the 17th century. From the 19th century and 20th century, Japan versus Russia or Switzerland, right? And economic performance better in non-resource-based Japan than Russia. And like I said, as I mentioned earlier, the comparison of East Asia or newly industrializing countries, NICs versus Latin America. This is most cited example, evidence for resource curse. East Asian countries, they outperformed the Latin American economies because of the lack of resources. Right? This is the best example, stark contrast. Right? Why East Asian economies grew faster than Latin American economies. There are many other factors, right? But this is most often cited example. Right, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. Yeah, we look into some more details of how this works, right? Why the lack of resources is a blessing rather than a curse. Yeah, we look into some more details over time. Right? In Latin American countries, in African countries, their economies. On the other hand, what makes this theory much more complex is that sometimes there are groups of countries that are both resource abundant but economically successful. What are these groups? Right? There are successful resource abundant countries, right? In the Western advanced country group, United States, Canada, Australia, right? And Norway in early 20th century, right? One of the poorest countries in Europe, but they have become one of the richest countries in the world, right? They moved ahead of Finland, Sweden, right? So what's the secret behind Norway's, management of resources? What is behind, right, the success, Norwegian success, or the U.S., Canadian, or Australian success, right? And more recent example, if you look at, if you read studies in the literature of resource curves, sometimes from African countries group, Botswana. Botswana is presented as one of the most successful resource-abundant economies. Botswana is specializing in diamond production. And there are several other successful ones, not in the advanced group, like Indonesia. Okay? So those successful ones, not in the advanced countries, was Botswana, Indonesia, these two groups. I think that the success behind the U.S., Canada, Australia, they are talking about, I think, in the 19th century first, right? In the 19th century. At that time, I think the resources these U.S., Canada, Australia was dependent on was not oil and gas, but I think mostly coal and other mineral type of resource items. So the question, I think people like Terry Linkar, she argues that, it's difficult to compare countries like U.S., Canada, Australia to countries like Latin America or African group, is that, the type of resource management or problems these resources raise must be different in the 19th century, right? And also in the 20th century. Oil and gas, mostly developing groups, kind of resource curse they suffer is mostly oil and gas related, right? Although America, Canada they're moving rapidly into oil and gas production again in the 21st century, right? This is kind of a figure that put every country. This is a resource, I think, dependence rate, percentage of merchandise exports during 1970-2008. This is economic growth, right? So these groups are economically, right, in terms of dependence, higher dependence if you go here, right? And including Korea, no resources, high economic growth rate, right? Different countries are located. Now, having said all this, I think the next step is, again, I mentioned some of these in previous classes. What causes the curse? This is important. What causes the curse? What's behind this negative paradox, right? There are some stylized facts, established information. This is, I think, which is important to know from this class. What are the stylized facts about the resource curves? Both in both fields, in economics and political science, they're having a hard time in explaining this. It's so complex, right? Sometimes they have to draw a general theory, right? And at the same time, they have to apply it to specific countries. Existing explanations, right? They're stylized. Existing explanations can be categorized into, I think, 4. I need to revise this a little bit. 4 broad explanations. Okay, there are 4 broad explanations for the resource curse. One is social explanation. Okay, social explanations for the resource curse. The resource curse is socially explained. Okay, so-called the social causes of the resource curse. Second, economic causes, economic explanations. Part of this economic explanation is Dutch disease. Dutch disease is part of the economic explanation. And third, political explanation, political resource curse. And finally, most recent theory, most recent explanation is institutional resource curse, institutional explanation for the resource curse. So I want to add institutional explanation here. So there are 4 broad explanations. Right? In other words, why countries, right, suffer the resource curse when they have abundant resources, because there are 4 reasons. Because of these 4 reasons. Number 1, social explanation. This is a little bit tricky and I think very delicate explanation. Why countries suffer, right, when they have free windfall profits from resource exports? Because the laziness, because of the laziness. Because if you have free incomes from resource exports, that makes the entire system lazy. That's social explanation. Because I think this is not purely a social explanation. At the same time, this is economic explanation. These free incomes from resource exports make not individuals, but also the entire system. Because, you know, the Asian success, why Asian countries are successful, have been successful, because we knew that we have nothing else, right, except, you know, our efforts, people's talent, right? The Korean government knew from the very beginning, right, that they must rely on people's talent, right? There is no explanation, there is no expectation from free exports, free incomes. Economists say that economic rents, right? We Koreans didn't enjoy any rents, right? Rents meaning incomes from non-labor-based production, right? So when you have this free income, right, the entire system is distorted because of this laziness, psychological laziness, right? Yes, a lot of sociology develops this kind of theories. Sociologists. Cognitive explanations. And I think this problem of laziness also explains why democracy doesn't develop in resource abundant countries. Again, you know, in a normal economy, right, when companies, right, produce items and they export, and then they pay taxes to the government. This is normal economy, right? Where resource-based economies, there is no company, right? They don't pay taxes to the government, right? I think this is very important for how democracy occurs and how markets develop. I think when you don't pay taxes, right? When you pay taxes, right, you demand something from the government, right? That's accountability, right? And most Middle Eastern, African countries, I think the political system doesn't develop because this kind of accountability doesn't develop, right? So, in other words, because the government doesn't have to rely on taxes from the companies, right? That means the government, right, sort of technically they bribes the citizen so that the citizens support the government, right? So I think this is related to the political development also. Economic explanations. Again, there are several aspects. One is, when a country is dependent on resource exports, the economic performance is worse because, first, declining terms of trade. Decline in the terms of trade for primary commodities. This is one explanation for why resource abundant countries, they suffer lower economic growth rate. The terms of trade over time decline for resource-based economies. In other words, I think this is a reflection of the global economic structure, where this goes against the comparative advantage theory. Adam Smith type of market theory. Every country they must specialize in items they are good at producing, right? And when they exchange, right, the entire pie on a global scale grows. That's comparative advantage, right? But this theory, I think the resource curse proves that this comparative advantage doesn't apply to resource-based countries. Because when resource-based countries, when they specialize in raw materials production, and when they exchange it with advanced manufacturing exporting countries, right? Over time, the terms of trade, right, is disadvantageous for resource-based countries. In other words, the terms of trade is a ratio of raw materials export value versus manufacturing export value, right? To buy manufacturing item, the more items you need to export, the more resource items you need to export to buy the same unit of manufacturing items. That's declining terms of trade. I think this question has been raised by many economists in the developing countries, particularly in the Latin American countries from the 60s, right? They rebelled against Western type of liberal market theory based on this this theory. Related to this, second aspect, resource-based economies, they suffer because the international commodity prices are unstable. Okay, the instability of international commodity markets. there are booms and busts, right? There's the cycles of booms and busts, right? So 70s and 80s, the booming period for resource exporting countries, right? But again, busts follow, right? So if you average out all the cycles, then the average economic growth rate is lower than advanced countries, non-oil-based countries. So this second aspect, the instability of international commodity prices. In other words, commodity price fluctuations. This is the second explanations. And third aspect, the poor linkage. This is important. The poor linkage between resource and non-resource sectors. Because of this, resource-based economies, their growth rate over time, right, goes down compared to non-oil-based economies. The poor linkage between resource and non-resource sector. In other words, even in the booming period, right, when targeted specific raw materials sector develops, other non-resource sectors like agricultural sector and manufacturing sector compared to resource sector slows down in terms of economic growth rate. Because commodity exports generate little growth in other sectors of the economy, such as agriculture and manufacturing industry. And this is known as the Dutch disease. Dutch disease. In other words, the Dutch disease, I think this is a related phenomenon. The Dutch disease. First, I think this is an example from the Netherlands, the Dutch economy, the experience of the Netherlands when they discovered natural gas reserves off the North Sea in the 60s. What they have found after the discovery of North Sea natural gas is that their economies tend to suffer high inflation rate. And other manufacturing industries and agricultural industries, the growth rate of manufacturing industry and agriculture industry tend to slow down. And the reason, first, interest rate appreciation. Okay, when natural resource booms occur, exchange rate tend to appreciate, and because of this, this results in inflation. And because booming non-tradable sector, resource sector, they pay higher compensation. The labor and capital migrates to the booming non-trading sector, right? So both of these combine to non-tradable sector like manufacturing and agricultural sector, less competitive, and they crowd out previously productive sectors. Again, example of this evidence. There are many cases that indicate this is the case. First, the Nigerian case. 1987, 1990, they began to reduce oil exports, okay? And their manufacturing industry began to boom, began to develop, right? This is, and again, 1991, when oil revenues began to increase again, and Nigerian manufacturing industry began to slow down again, right? I think that there are many examples like this in the Russian economy, and also in the Central Asian economy. And I mentioned, if you read Thomas Friedman's book, he takes a very interesting example from Bahrain. Bahrain from the Persian Gulf area. Again, like Nigeria, right? I mean, this example shows why oil development focus is detrimental to that economy, right? This shows that this is the lesson, right? And the example of Bahrain, what is interesting about Bahrain economy is that there is no example like Bahrain, because Bahrain, they gave up on oil production, okay? They found that their oil reserves have dried up, right, in the 1990s. And many good changes began to occur after they found out that their oil reserves have dried up, right? And many good changes that many Western economists and many Western institutions recommended for a long time that they haven't implemented. And all these good changes began to occur when they have found that their oil reserves have dried up, right? Again, this is because of the market changes, right? Nigerian economy, when they have good international oil markets, right, and they focus on oil production, right, then their economies began to be distorted, right? And when the oil market is not good, then they slow down oil production, but economy is going in the good direction, right direction, right? Bahrain, same thing. Russia, same thing. I'm not sure about Central Asia, but I mean, the lesson from this is it's not 100% like a government can have control over all this process, but clearly these external market changes sort of incentivize the local governments to, right, have a such and such policy. You know why this occurs, You know, MNCs are also related, right? Multinational oil companies, they are related. A little bit different story, but Korea is also in a similar situation. The chairman of Samsung is now sick, right? Not many days left before he dies, probably. But Korean economy is different from Nigerian economy, different from African economy. But in a sense, Korean economy is similar, right? In a sense, we heavily depend on some specific Jabil companies, in Samsung particularly, right? I think that has some problem. That has similar effects on the entire Korean economic system or the political system, right? So Korean economy is highly subject to like a semiconductor market shift, global market of semiconductor. The Korean economy is subject to those changes. Nigeria is right? Subject to oil market changes, right? Oil price fluctuations. Right? This clearly indicates, right? These countries are subject to oil market shifts, oil market prices, cycles of global oil market. And the more you depend on resource export sector, your non-oil sector, right, dies, right? That's the problem. Non-oil sector dies, and particularly the manufacturing sector dies, and your political system distorted, right? So then how to escape, right? There have been many discussions about how to escape these curse. When you have good international oil market, you depend on exports, then you have high inflation, right? And your currency appreciation, right? When your currency appreciates, right? Manufacturing exports slow down. That's the problem. Agricultural exports slow down because of the appreciation of the currency. So only oil sector survives. That's the problem. Agricultural, manufacturing sectors, they disadvantages by this oil boom. Then how to escape it, right? Is there any way of exporting oil, but at the same time surviving, escaping the curse? How did the Netherlands escape, right? How did Norway escape, right? Then there are some things they have. There are some things that they have. One of these many scholars recommend to escape the curse. First, you need to have very tight fiscal policy, right? Like I said, this is something called spending effects. I mean, it was there already. It was contained in previous slides. Spending effect. One of the process of being contained with this curse is something called spending effect. In the boom period, in the booming period, when you export oil and gas, the government tends to spend budget, right? The government. That's spending effect, right? They have no sense of tight fiscal policy because they have abundant money. You tend to spend. You tend to expand the government, right? And you need to bribe citizens, like I said, to attain support from citizens, right? So you need to spend, right? That fuels inflation. So while enjoying resource exports, you need to make sure you maintain tight fiscal policy. Again, this is very much like IMF recommendation, right? But this is important. So for every resource exporting countries, many economists recommend you need to, right, maintain tight fiscal policy. But this is difficult because, right, every dictator like Putin, how many followers he has, and all the followers for him, because his government is not legitimate, right? And his government relies on oil and gas imports, right? And he doesn't have legitimacy. He's hated by citizens. Then he needs to spend a lot of money to maintain the system. So this is much easier said than done, particularly for dictators like Putin and many leaders in oil exporting countries. This is a very difficult one. Right? Even his protege, I mean his followers in his government, right? As a leader, you need to bribe him. You need to bribe many people around him. Right? Second, subsidize. To escape the curse, you need to subsidize non-tradable sector, like agricultural sector, manufacturing sector, the government, right? Subsidize those non-resource sectors. This is another way of escaping the curse. Third, you need to save profits. You need to save windfalls, right? In the form of some trust fund. This is something that is emphasized by over and over again by many institutions and Western economies, right? Like an oil fund, right? So place windfall profits, right? And this will help to keep exchange rate from appreciating, right? Yeah, many people talk about this. I mean, currency appreciation. This is very detrimental for economies like, dependent on certain sector. Also in Korea, same thing. In specific sector, when you have dependence on specific sector, and that is export-oriented, you have this problem, currency appreciation. Now, then political explanations. Political explanations. This is a more recent explanation. So when you have resource abundance, resource dependence, then you have dictators. This is one of the theses that Thomas Friedman, right, advanced. Politics 101, Petropolitics 101. There is a opposite relationship between resource income and democracy. Again, the underlying reasons of the resource curse, the political reasons. Number one explanation in the political explanation is that resource booms have tendency to weaken state institutions. Okay, this is one explanation. State institutions are weakened, stunted. State institutions such as these boom times, right? State institutions like elections, right? Tax capacity, everything is weakened, right? Elections, right? Elections, tax capacity. You know why tax capacity is weakened? When you have resource abundance, right? Tax institution is weakened, right? And electoral process weakened, right? Those normal political institutions, right, are weakened. Again, this is similar to social explanation. Resource abundance induces myopia or extravagance in policymakers. This is interesting statements. Myopia and extravagance among policymakers, right? You have, the leaders. This is exactly the attitude Putin developed in 1999, 2000, 2001. He misunderstood, Putin misunderstood that Russia was a great power, right? When when the oil prices were going up, the booming period, right? And he had very narrow vision, narrow perspective on international affairs, right? And he thought that Russia could develop based on resource exports, right? Maybe in several decades, Russia will emerge again as a great power. I mentioned this. This is a statement from Terry Linkar. Oil rents produce a rentier state. The state becomes a rentier state. The state becomes a rentier state. Rentier state. Again, this is one of the theories that explain Middle Eastern political system. Middle Eastern states were rentier states, right? Do you know when this concept of rentier was used in the studies of Karl Marx? Karl Marx described bourgeoisie as a rentier class, right? Labor class, bourgeoisie class. Bourgeoisie class is a rentier class because they don't produce. I mean, they don't put labor into production of some items, right? They just enjoy profits from labor from someone else. That's rentier, right? So here, rentier state, Middle Eastern states are rentier states, okay? States that are not based on real, labor-based production, right? They enjoy more windfall profits from oil exports, right? Then why this is a problem for political development perspective? As I mentioned earlier, this is a problem from political development perspective because when government, they don't need to, when they have no need for taxes from their citizens, right? And citizens, they lose the incentive to demand accountability, right, for the government, right? Because when there is no taxes, there is no accountability, right? So normal Western democracy, normal political system, accountability and taxability of the government is basic. Final explanation, institutional explanation. This is a more recent explanation. The argument goes like this. Again, this is based on a specific school in economics, which is institutional economics. Right? There's a group of economists that are categorized as institutional economists, like David North, Danny Roderick, and these institutional economists. I think we don't need to spend a lot of time in explaining what institutional economics is. That here the argument is Dutch disease and political Dutch disease, economic Dutch disease. Everything is not a problem of the assumption is institution is more important as a determinant of economic growth, right? Basic assumption. And the scholar who argued this is Douglas North, right? And for him, economy is determined by institutions, good institutions, bad institutions, and institutions are rules of the game, blah, 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 right? And these rules of game constrain human behavior, right? Why do you laugh? Oh, right. So institutional economics is a criticism of behavioral economics. You know, many neoliberal economists, they were based on behavioral economics, right? So these institutional economists, Jeffrey Sachs, Danny Roderick, and all these, they criticize, you know, neoliberal behavioral-based economies, right? And again, the argument is, right, the countries that are that suffer resource crises, their problem is problem with institutions, institutional deficits. So institutional development is stunted because of resource dependence. You know, the explanations of the mechanism of Dutch disease, right? You depend on certain sector, then inflation, then currency appreciation, non-tradable sector suffer, right? Manufacturing, agriculture sector suffer. These are all traditional, like behavioral type of explanations, non-institutional explanations, right? And these institutional economists argue more important than these Dutch disease phenomena is, you know, corruption, right? Institutional underdevelopment, things like this, right? So this is institutional explanation of resource curse. And they explain right, the examples of Nigerian problem from institutional property rights, right? Because of resource abundance, resource dependence, property rights doesn't develop, right? This is institutional explanations. You know, academic theories, they have fashions, right? Yeah. In political type of resource curse, yes, you see theories more in this institutional type of tradition nowadays. So there, in the Journal of Political Science, you have you know, more articles that look at this Dutch disease problem from, you know, institutions rather than Dutch disease is an old theory, right? So the more you know, theories develop surrounding the conception of corruption, property rights, institutional problems, right? Things like that. Then I think we need to shift to this case, then resource curse in Africa. Right? Having said all these general like propositions, then we need to go ahead to look into specific cases. Then, right, what special characteristics of resource curse in Africa, right? Then I think chapter 12 does that. If you read chapter 12, Sub-Saharan Africa, like Nigeria, what countries? Mauritania, right? Mozambique, Tanzania, right? Angola, Sudan, Gabon, this country, all these countries, right? Then you can read chapter 12, right? Having done all this, then what is, you know, how is the resource curse in Africa different from the resource curse in Russia, resource curse in Central Asia, resource curse in the Middle East, right? And some interesting information contained in chapter 12. Can you turn to page 260 if you have the book? You don't have the book? Okay. If you turn to page 260, right, there's a list of oil exporters in sub-Saharan Africa. Right? In terms of this table shows, oil exports to the U.S. Right? They are listing sub-Saharan oil exporters as to the United States. But this is, I think, the list of from the biggest oil exporters in sub-Saharan Africa to the smallest one. So the biggest one, if you read this, Nigeria is the biggest one. The longest, probably, long-standing oil exporter from sub-Saharan Africa, right? Nigeria, biggest one. Then Angola, right? Then Chad, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and you have all these countries, Congo, DRC, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and all these countries. And this article, this chapter 12, is devoted more to the external dimension than this internal resource curse. I mean, they discuss a little bit about this resource curse, but mostly external dimension, how sub-Saharan export-import relations are changing, right, after shale gas, shale revolution in the North American region. Some changes. There are some changes. And probably the biggest change after North American shale revolution is there's a drastic drop, right? Drastic drop in U.S. imports from sub-Saharan Africa. That's one change. First biggest change, drastic drop in U.S. imports from sub-Saharan Africa. Right? So, again, table 12.2 to 60. This shows how sub-Saharan African exports reduced from 2006, 2011, 2012. Nigerian exports almost cut in half. Right? Nigerian exports to the United States cut in half. Like from 1 million barrel to almost 500, less than 500,000 barrels, cut in half. Because the quality of oil from sub-Saharan Africa is a good quality. African oil, good quality, much better quality than Russian oil. In terms of purity, right? It is called sweet type of crude, right? Light and sweet type of crude oil. That's African crude oil, right? Which is similar to U.S. shale oil, right? So quality is very similar. So America doesn't need to import anymore from Nigeria. Right? That's why the import is drastically reduced currently. So the biggest drop is found in Nigeria. Right? You see the Boko Haram, right? The conflict over these schoolgirls, right? Why that? We need to look more into this Nigerian conflicts, but I think problem Boko Haram raises is resource curse. Again, Nigerian resource curse. This chapter explains quite well the resource curse in Nigeria. Right? Nigerian resource curse. Right. I think African oil exporters, best example. Right. Best fitting example. And resource curse is confirmed from African cases. Nigeria, Gabon, Angola, these are older oil exporters. And Nigeria, biggest one. Equatorial Guinea and Tanzania, Mozambique, they are new newly emerging exporters. Mozambique, Tanzania, gas exporters. Right? Let's look at Nigeria, resource curse in Nigeria. Nigeria, largest oil producing nation in Africa, 6th largest oil producer in the world, and 5th largest producer in the OPEC, and 5th largest supplier oil to the United States, although it is coming down in the list, right? And since we are running out of time, you better read pages 268, 269, 270. 268, 69, 270. It's a section on the Nigerian resource curse. Right? Nigerian resource curse. Okay, I'll see you Wednesday. Wednesday, I think that Wednesday, another resource course. I'll talk about Russia, Central Asia. Then next week, chapter 13, 14, like Northeast Asia, China, India, things like that. So this week, resource course.